Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. G'day, welcome back to another episode of Passive House Podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
It's almost the end of summer here, Zach, but still pretty warm. Lots of long sunny days. Slightly cooler in the mornings, but we're still getting lots of very warm temperatures here. But you've been out enjoying the snow.
Indeed. Yeah, we were just talking about this. So I was up on Mount Baker for a couple of days with my family, with our three kids and my wife, and really enjoying just beautiful sunny skies, quite cold, and some really fun skiing. But in stark contrast to your plans this morning.
Yeah. Heading out for an ocean swim,
exactly.
with very warm water temperatures around Auckland at the moment, which lots of people are enjoying. And it's great to be able to get out there. We're sort of getting right up into the big wave of Omicron right now, but thankfully people are still out and about enjoying what they're doing, and things are busy. Building industry is really cranking along. There's a lot of activity. And a lot of people I've noticed asking some really good questions about carbon and about energy efficiency. I had a really great discussion with someone just yesterday about building passive house, designing passive house in hot climates. So there's just some really exciting stuff going on around the place.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Including our feature interview this week with Alex Slater from Australia. But before we get into that, let's give a shout out to our supporters.
Let's do. So thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Bax to Ingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks as well to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Proseco, and SIGA. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I caught up with Alex Slater, who's an architect and a NatHERS Assessor, which I'll talk about. He's a passive house designer, and he's also done and does a little bit of tutoring and education about passive house and sustainable design. He's based in Melbourne, but does a bit of work around the east coast of Australia, which I'm always really interested in, how people are implementing passive house in that part of the world. Now, NatHERS, we have talked about in the past on the podcast, because anyone who works in Australia is very familiar with NatHERS. It's Nat, N-A-T, HERS, H-E-R-S. So it's the National Home Energy Rating Scheme. And depending on who you ask, it has various degrees of dislike, particularly among passive house enthusiasts, because it is a relatively basic energy assessment when you compare it to something like passive house. But it is broad in terms of its usage and its requirements. Most houses in a lot of Australia are required to have a NatHERS rating when they're built or sold. So it provides quite an interesting benchmark and a comparison of wide-scale, fairly basic energy modelling to much more accurate, detailed energy modelling that you might get through PHPP, but on a smaller scale. Alex's company is Shared Space, and he integrates a lot of his technical knowledge with the art of architecture, and trying to enabling what he calls the benefit of all aspects of architecture. So let's jump into it. And we also talk about R value quite a lot in this episode. Zach, what's the conversion? Because we're talking metric R value. So these numbers, they're pretty low, but they're not as scary low as they might sound when we're talking about R of 5 or 6.
Right, exactly. So the multiplier you do is about 5.7. So for example, an R value for you of 4 is an R value of about 23 for us. And an R value of 6 is an R value of about 34 for us in North America.
Awesome. All right. Well, here he is. Here's my chat with Alex Slater of Shared Space.
So let's start off with talking about you and your journey, Alex. It's awesome to have you with us on the show. Tell us how you got started in architecture to start with.
In architecture probably started when I was at school, and I had an engineering class at school, and that engineering class had technical drawing, and it was something I really enjoyed. And even before then, there was a sense that the built environment was a really good place to move. I remember even at the age of 6 or 7, or even a little bit earlier, trying to work out how an underground house works.
Nice.
And what all the plumbing requirements were, where the water's stored, where the energy comes from. And there's an A4 sheet of paper I could see in my mind that had these little bits and pieces. So it's probably destined from a very early age. After school, I did the Bachelor of Arts in Architecture at the University of Canberra. And that was a 3-year course, which was very artistic.
Uh-huh.
And I came in from a left brain thinking process. So successfully fumbled my way through art, and worked out how to use the right brain a bit more, which was very helpful for future studies. And then worked with an architect, Jeff Driscoll, in Canberra for 3.5 years after that, and mainly residential. We did a church as well and community groups, and now even from then, we were always looking at energy efficient buildings, and how we can be practical and energy efficient.
Right.
And so that was really good startup.
Where did that come from? Like your interest in energy efficiency, was that something that was taught during your training, or was it something that you'd grown out of your upbringing?
I was curious. So what's this first rate 5 is what we use here in Canberra. And it models a house and tells you how much energy it uses. And I thought, that's cool.
Yeah.
And so so I used to do that just with the projects we were doing. I was unaccredited and all that. I thought, just for something to do.
Right.
See what happens.
Yeah.
And that kind of sparked an interest. And I think the combination of design and science has been really fun, because you can see the changes you make in the design and what they do on the changes that you use with the energy.
Yep.
Or the energy usage. And you can see, what happens when I rotate a house or something. And First Rate had those tools where you could look at different orientations.
So First Rate 5 is a energy modeling software?
Yeah. So I started off with First Rate 5 back in 2010.
And that was out of just your personal interest. It's not something...
Jeff used it. Jeff used it quite a lot here in Canberra.
Right.
So...
But was it something that clients were asking for?
It was requisite to get a 6-star home. I think at that stage it was 5-star home. And so if we could use the software to have an estimate before we give it to an energy rater, then we thought that was a good thing to deliver to the client.
Right. And so that requirement, was that a national requirement at the time, or was just Canberra?
National. It's still national, and it's moving to 7-star this year.
Right.
So that's our NatHERS rating.
Okay, so this has come up a couple of times, but for people outside of Australia, NatHERS, that's the National Home Energy Rating Scheme, and so first rate was one of the options you could use for. Is it an option to use that for your NatHERS, or you still have to go through NatHERS separately?
Well, NatHERS is the engine. It's a Cheneth engine developed by the CSIRO, and then there are a number of softwares that use that engine.
Right.
First rate is one of those.
Right.
Then you got Hero software I've worked with, which is new and awesome.
Right.
And then Burrs Pro and Accurate.
So that gave you a pretty good grounding in understanding things like orientation, like you mentioned, insulation. Does it account for things like infiltration and ventilation?
There's no requirement in the current code to look at ventilation,
right?
Infiltration.
Yeah.
That's coming in 2022.
And what about overheating? Is it primarily for winter calculations of comfort, or does it also assess the chances of a house getting too hot?
Well, it looks at both, and there's a threshold. So if you're a predominantly heating climate, then you would reach the heating limit before you reach the cooling limit.
Right. So it sounds pretty comprehensive in terms of comfort modelling as well as energy modelling, because they're kind of
I mean, yes, because there are also there's also an added benefit in there which isn't, to my knowledge, in Passive House, or certainly not in Passive House or PHPP 9, might be in 10, with the use of ceiling fans, which provides a different comfort, because the ceiling fans are arguably comfortable in a climate that needs cooling that doesn't necessarily need an air conditioner. So that's one example in NatHERS where you can use ceiling fans to your advantage to increase your star rating.
And they're massively more efficient, right? So just a ceiling fan gently turning around, if that gives you a level of comfort, that's a much more cost-effective option than cranking up a full air conditioner.
Well, the manufacturing process of a ceiling fan is much simpler. The parts of a ceiling fan are much simpler.
Yeah.
The energy usage is much less.
Yep.
So yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know growing up in South Australia, in Adelaide's very, very dry in summertime, and they have quite a lot of evaporative cooling there. Do you utilise that at all in Canberra, or is it getting a bit too far north for that to work?
Oh, Canberra, it works well with evaporative, with the dry climate. Probably not as well in Melbourne or Sydney, given the coastal climate.
Right, interesting.
There, but it certainly works well in Canberra. The home I grew up in had an evaporative cooler from, I think it was installed when I was about maybe 12 or something.
Yeah.
And it was effective.
Yeah.
But you had to leave all the windows open, which is also a nice way to have comfort in summer. And because Canberra, you predominantly use the heater for probably 10 months of the year, maybe not that much, maybe 9 months or 8 months, then it's really only the peak times, end of January, start of February, where you would use the evaporative cooler.
Yeah.
So you could do that, and it might not be a favourable cost, given it's only used for 2 weeks of the year, but it's cheaper than an air conditioner, But then, the downside of it is it doesn't do heating and cooling.
No.
It just does cooling.
No, and there are some other issues or concerns around water use and the fact that you're dumping quite high humidity into the house.
I replumbed the wastewater to the garden.
Right. From my
parents' place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's it. I want to talk about. I'm really interested in typology and the design of houses across Australia and across those warmer climates. Prior to your work in Passive House, how would you describe the typical Canberra house or eastern state house in Australia? What does it look like if you're describing it to a North American?
Eastern state house is probably too broad. Canberra house, three bedroom, red brick.
Right.
Well, very common.
Yeah.
But also brick veneer, it would be fairly eastern state.
Yeah.
That's a construction type that was really kicked off in Melbourne.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Sydney has weatherboard construction, predominantly in the older houses.
So sort of fairly lightweight frame.
Yeah.
Possibly either with a timber veneer or maybe a brick veneer on the outside.
Correct.
Not a lot of insulation. Traditionally.
Not the older houses. Newer houses often had insulation and sarking, which was not vapor permeable.
Yeah.
So there's possibly an issue there without enough ventilation.
Bit of foil in there, maybe.
Yeah.
And what about windows?
Windows I've seen predominantly in Canberra single glazed. A lot of upgrades moving to double glazed now. Window area is fairly standard. You've got your 1800 by 1500 metric windows in bedrooms generally. There's 600 by 900 windows in bathrooms. So they're kind of the standard size.
An aluminium frame or timber frame?
Yeah, aluminium, but also timber.
Yeah.
So a bit of mix there.
When did you first discover Passive House, and how did that come about?
I ended up working with Carbon Light in Melbourne and learned about Passive House, or was aware of Passive House from that job, because they're prefab passive house builder.
Yeah, we've had Bjorn on the show. So Burkhart, very fan of the show, fan of his work from way back.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Was that client driven, or how did that project come about?
Oh no, I was employed. I was employed at Carbon Light.
Oh, you were working with them, so doing some of their design work.
So I was employed as a designer, and then ended up doing a fair amount of shop drawings as well.
Nice.
So,
well, that would be a good deep dive into the world of Passive House, because I'm not sure if he's still doing it, but he was actually doing some of the tradesperson training, I think, out of his workshop, Carbon Light.
Yeah, with Box Hill Institute. So right. I've seen about 2 or 3 classes go through there. So, yeah.
And so from there, did you go along and get yourself trained as a Passive House designer?
Yeah, I did. I think it was 2017. I put an application in for training, and so ended up doing the training in 2017, and it was thanks to Pro Climber for that one. So I ended up with a scholarship. So that training was paid for, and just was interested. I was taught by Claire Parry, and then I had a keen interest in Excel anyway. So anything Excel was like, oh, can you actually do stuff in Excel that's useful. And yeah, you can do lots of things that are useful in Excel.
Yeah.
So I did that and got excited about Excel, and then got more excited about Excel, and then worked out certain things. And I built things in Excel for years before I did Passive House.
Right.
So I kind of I wasn't afraid of it.
What were your impressions when you're going through that course based on your previous experience already doing some energy modeling? Do you remember how you felt and what that experience was like?
Yeah, I had a good foundation. And the things that grew me were looking at the importance of moisture management and the importance of air tightness.
Yep.
And also the ramifications of thermal bridges. They're probably the three things that have grown me since.
Right.
On top of what I knew.
Yep.
Like I understood orientation, building facade performance, colors of roofs and things like that. What ceilings insulation does versus roof insulation. So I understood a lot of that, but added in those three things.
And how has that influenced your work since then? How's it changed your designs?
I'm careful about membranes and what to recommend.
Yep.
I'm also careful about thermal bridges and try to avoid details that carry large thermal bridges through. Okay with timber running from the outside to the inside, but if we can mitigate that, that's fine. If we can work out a detail where you have whaling plates on each side of the wall or something, then that's probably better. So I've changed the way I think about how things are put together. That's also with prefab experience.
Yeah.
And it's a different thing. If you're drawing a house for site construction, you draw it differently. You probably use less material, but the drawing's different. If you're drawing for prefab, then you're working out the layers.
Right.
And in a way, prefab helps with mitigating thermal bridges.
Yeah. Because
you're drawing the building envelope and then you're modeling in the additions that give you the features that are required.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to piece things together piece by piece. That's probably what grew me then. So
do you still work, or do you try and work predominantly in prefab still?
No, I do whatever comes along.
Right.
Prefab's fun, and I think there's a time and place.
Uh-huh.
There's a time and place, and I would try and make that assessment early on, whether it's a good prefab job or not.
Yeah.
Good volume prefab, energy efficient volume prefab is excellent. I think the country needs that. But so is the artistic license with extensions and trying to find space in intricate blocks, particularly in a city like Melbourne.
Yeah.
And parts of Sydney as well. I should say parts of Melbourne as well, where the blocks are so tight and confined, and there are regulations for overlooking and things like that. That odd shapes do come as a result of form studies.
Looking back at that more typical design of a lightweight timber frame or a brick veneer with probably not going to do single glazing on a house, but would you attempt to do a house that looks like a typical Australian house? Do your designs look like a typical Australian house, or do you kind of ignore that stereotypical design and start with something completely different?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I've had projects where a typical Australian look has been requested by the client.
Mm-hmm.
I've had projects where that's not as important. I've had projects where the volume or the space inside is important. So I would tend to think that it's what's been requested of me.
Right.
and not necessarily requested of me by the client. There might be an overlaying look that is implied in the precinct or something,
Right.
and that would then be requested of me by the council.
Yep.
So I think I'd work with the parameters that I have.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was an open field, then I'd probably be lost.
Right.
So
it's good to have some parameters, some restrictions.
Yeah, it is, and I think I haven't come across a project where that hasn't been helpful.
Right. To work
to
within
have
those
some
boundaries.
parameters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, you just explode. I think.
Yeah.
Maybe some architects are much better than that, and they can deal with it. But
no, I think you're right.
Parameters.
I think it helps to have some constraints and some boundaries, whether they're artistic or physical or legal, whether they're consenting requirements, those sorts of things. And that's the skill of a good designer is to come up with something that is appealing and works within those constraints. Then, of course, have budgetary constraints as well.
Yeah.
I know that some of those typical construction methodologies, like brick veneer, can be quite challenging for reducing thermal bridges, for example, particularly when it comes to floor wall connections. And I've spoken to a few designers in Perth who very similar industry over there, where that's the sort of most popular construction material, and it can be very hard to do a passive house with that material because of those design details. So it's exciting to see that kind of get thought through from an Australian perspective.
I think it's the experience I've had with looking at details for brick veneer. Yes, insulation is hard to get to, but also I think airtightness or protecting the outside surface of the thermal envelope is hard.
Right. Yes.
And because I think that it thermally speaking, my understanding is that it's separated because you've got an engaged pier in a brick wall. So you've got usually a single layer of brick, and then there's an engaged pier which makes a double layer of brick underneath the bearers.
Right. Yeah.
And then on top of the bearers, you've got the joists. So it's that connection from the joist to the bearer to the engaged column that would be difficult to wrap and or protect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then all the brick ties in from on the studs.
Yeah.
So
yeah, lots of little thermal bridges there, and a concrete slab causes some headaches as well, with having a big bit of concrete at the bottom there with bricks sitting on top of it. That can be quite challenging to figure out how to do that with reducing a thermal bridge there.
Yeah, slab edge insulation is pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's also, you include that in NatHERS ratings. So there are a lot of similarities between NatHERS and Passive House in this sense.
Yeah, which is nice because a lot of people, particularly who get really into Passive House, tend to look at other things like NatHERS as inferior and criticise them. I guess NatHERS is there. It's required, so it's got a lot of awareness and everyone's going to use it. How do you see the two working together?
Well, ultimately, they're both building physics.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, they've both been compiled as a result of years of study, absolute years of study by people that have researched different houses, different buildings, different construction types, and have collected data.
Yeah. And
that data has then built engines. One which is the Cheneth engine, which is for NatHERS, and the other which is the Passive House planning package for Passive House. And so really it's the research that drives the engine. So really as an input, I've been both accredited, an accredited Passive House designer and an accredited or certified NatHERS assessor.
Mm-hmm.
It's the inputs that I put into the software that then drive the engine to give a result. So, as I say, they're both building physics. One thing that I find really useful with the Passive House Planning package is it's not a black box, where you can drill down and see where the calculations are occurring.
Yeah.
With NatHERS, it is a black box in a sense. However, if you know the way that the building physics of that engine works, and you know what's going to be beneficial and what's not, and you can drive it in a way that is beneficial for the client as well as reducing energy usage, then you can kind of blur the boundaries of that black box.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. And I guess it's got to be a little bit of a black box because it's a required certificate. You can't have
Correct.
people just opening up and tampering with it. It's got to
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Which, yeah, and I can see that people who do want to do that and who want to drive it more, that could be a frustration. But on the other side, it's mandated, which is a good thing in terms of really forcing people to do that energy model, but also keeping it open to the market, right? Because there's a minimum requirement that you can go further. What are the current requirements, and what's the scale for NatHERS?
Well, okay, so NatHERS 10-star scale. Currently, we need to meet 6 stars for new homes. That's changing in May this year to 7 stars, and that's the requirement. The other thing with that is that you need to be an accredited NatHERS rater or certified NatHERS rater to produce a certificate.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that someone who isn't accredited can download the software and still model to an extent. And I think that's where another benefit of the black box is.
Yeah.
Is the variables are quite translatable.
Right.
Or understandable. I should use the word understandable. They're understandable to people to download the software, model the home, choose the windows, choose the insulation, and you know what your star rating's going to be roughly.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Does a 6 NatHERS, what does that mean in terms of energy? Is there a defined energy performance standard in the same way that Passive House has a 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum? Is there an equivalent energy band?
Yeah, it varies. It varies depending on your location and climate.
Right.
So those with a harsher climate are able to use more energy than those with a less harsh climate. And the energy output's measured in megajoules per square meter.
Right. And I think people can, if people want to drill down into that, they can search up and look at what those Energy Star rating requirements are, and quite a large number of climate zones.
Yeah, I think that at the moment there's 66, and I think it's going to 82.
Right. So it gets quite specific and gets very location specific. Which
in a way is cool. Because, I mean, you do the same thing with the Passive House Planning package by changing the altitude and all sorts of stuff. So you can model based on a set of data, but how close that data is to the actual climate, I still don't know. But you can also look at histories of where the project's close to and use the altitude to work with that and see, you can vary up or vary down the altitude.
Yeah.
And that changes the harshness of the climate.
Yeah. I'm just looking through some of those now. There's quite a range, but I think importantly, because some people might be listening to that and thinking, oh, well, that just allows you to be less energy efficient if you're in a colder climate. And looking through those ratings, I think that is the case, but it's more pronounced lower down in the scale. Like the further up you get towards 10, there's less variance in the
correct
that megajoules per square meter. So, if you're going to be getting up around an 8 or 9 star on NatHERS, you're going to have to be doing pretty well.
Oh, yeah.
Wherever your house is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with from seven stars up, it's not a huge difference.
Right.
Yeah.
So your practice, you're you're in Canberra at the moment, but you do a bit of work up and down the East Coast.
Yeah, I've had a job in Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne, country Victoria. It's called shared space architecture, and it's shared space.
Yeah.
So we've got the office address is in Canberra, but I work where I am.
And you're not exclusively passive house, right? You don't require every project to be certified as a passive house project.
Correct, and I have used the PHPP before to provide energy efficiency knowledge or building envelope knowledge, so you can say, this wall is going to perform much better than any other wall.
Yep.
But the short answer is no. There's no need to be passive house. That's kind of inherent in the way that we're going to design anyway.
Right.
And I just see it as I like to use the term. I just see it as building physics, and try and work with some parameter to make something efficient.
And how does that conversation go when you use the software to talk to a client who hasn't asked you to do passive house, maybe because they don't know about it or it's just not what they're asking for, but you still use the software to look at it? Do they generally find that of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a fairly rigorous process with a project I did with Damaza Architects, with Anthony and his team there, and we looked at this project. We modelled it in the PHPP. It hasn't quite met passive house because of the air tightness. Otherwise, it would be.
Right.
And what's been really useful with that project is we could see, even though it doesn't meet the air tightness, it pretty much meets the same energy usage as passive house.
Right.
And so we could see that on the PHPP. And that's mainly because of quite a high overheating.
Yep.
And quite a high amount of insulation. And I know I took the question a little bit on a different path, but I'm going to use that as an example because I've worked with others who have not necessarily requested passive house, but I wouldn't do a model without asking. I would have a fair idea of what's going to be a better performing wall or not, and then ask about the windows and things, and then say, okay, well, do you want me to have a look at it in the PHPP just out of interest?
Yeah.
And then we can work with that, so we know. I don't necessarily say that every wall should be R4. I say, well, maybe you're going to get benefit of having an R6 wall somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
Because of the it's all a balance. And so if the R6 wall is somewhere and you can get away with R3 elsewhere, that might help with boundary walls and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's I think a really pragmatic use of PHPP, and also that's quite interesting. Looking at the end goal, which is that energy consumption and the comfort, the performance inside the house. Air tightness is a way to achieve that, and I think a lot of people get really hung up on that 0.6 air changes per hour. And certainly, you're going to need that if you do want to get a plaque on the wall and get a certificate. But I guess for some people that's important, is to get that sort of certification. But others, it's probably more about the actual health and comfort, and then the energy performance. And if you can achieve that with, less than one, between 1 and 0.6, then, that's still a really good outcome for a client.
It is. And look, the equivalent in NatHERS is in 2022, they're going to be asking for 10 cubic meters per square meter.
Right, of air tightness.
And I still can't understand that is 10 air changes per hour. I don't think it is, because we're dealing with 10 cubic meters for a square meter.
Yeah,
and I think that depends on ceiling height.
Yeah, it depends on the volume and the volume area ratio. There is an equivalence at a sort of average house size, but then it tends to I can't remember which way it goes off the top of my head now because it's a Friday afternoon. But yeah,
I've worked the equivalence I've worked out is somewhere between 3.5 and 6.8 or something.
Yeah,
like
right.
That.
Yeah,
but I don't think it's actually 10.
Yeah.
So, but with the going back to the using the PHPP to do different things. I've worked also on a project with Talina Edwards and her team, and we looked at how, it was out of interest to see if we can achieve passive house. And so, looking at the different options. So what I generally do is I put the house in as it is, as in the volume as it is. Then I drive it to meet passive house. And I just increase the insulation, increase the roof insulation, wall insulation, floor insulation.
Ignoring the budget for a moment.
Ignoring the budget for a moment. And then we peel it back. Okay, so if R6 is ridiculous for a wall, then let's make it R4 because we can fit that in 140 studs. What does that do to the performance?
Yeah.
If R9 is ridiculous in the roof, then let's peel it back to R7 because we can with 290 LVLs.
Right.
What does that do? And if windows are going to cost too much, then what do we do if we go to double glaze? Does that make a huge difference?
Yeah.
And so I build this sheet that has all these options.
Yep.
I just add another sheet in Excel because it's fun and you can show things. And then I say, okay, well, then that's passive house. This is reduced walls. This is reduced roof. This is reduced windows. And then you kind of find a happy medium.
Yeah.
And also at that point in time, we're talking with the builder.
Yeah.
And that process has been really good with the way that Talina works as well. And her team works with the projects. It's iterative. And I think really it comes down to, if you want something to be energy efficient, you've got to think about it in day one. But you iterate as the design changes.
Yeah.
So you know the ramifications of any changes.
Nice.
That are made.
Awesome. Hey, well, we're going to have to wrap up, Alex, but fantastic to catch up. We've got some great insights there. We haven't talked about the work you do, not just limited to new builds, but some great renovation projects and some other typologies that people can check that out on your website. I hope all things go well for you in 2022 and beyond. I imagine that I hear that things are picking up. There's more and more interest in passive house across Australia, which is great. I think there'll be more demand for the work that you're doing and inspiring across the country. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. A lot of the conversations are, how does this work? So
awesome.
If we can provide an answer of some kind or some help, that's awesome. Thanks, Matthew, and thanks for your time, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, see ya.
And that was Alex Slater of Shared Space Architecture. He's based in Melbourne, but does a bit of work up and down the east coast of Australia. Really great to catch up with him. And like I said, I really enjoy talking to people who are working in Australia and thinking about how to implement passive house, not just in the climatic context of a warm environment, but also in industry context of things like where NatHERS is required, and people, everyone knows what NatHERS is. People know about Green Star, but not everyone yet knows about passive house. So having that experience of clients coming and either having to take them on that educational journey, or they're people who have sort of come across it and then having to walk them through what the main differences are. What did you take out of it, Zach?
It was a great interview, really fun. I was struck by this sort of three legs of the stool for Alex of design, building science, and then also modeling. Like he's clearly very very passionate about energy modeling, various forms of energy modeling, passionate about Excel, which is there's a certain, I think all of us in the passive house world are nerds to some degree of some form or another, and we've got a wedge of the community that are Excel nerds. So I really appreciated hearing about that, and almost the kind of the journey through energy modeling and building science that led Alex to Passive House, and his particularly on that first work in prefab.
Yeah, I was reminded again just this week. I was doing a presentation actually with Jason Quinn, who's be a familiar name to many people, and he showed a great plot, which I've seen a number of times, but it's always great to see it again, of the as-built performance of a bunch of passive houses compared with some non-passive houses, or houses that have been modeled using different energy software. And it's quite amazing how well the PHPP modeled houses match up with their modeled performance. And Alex talks a little bit about that modeling is just modeling, and it's not always guaranteed. But I'm always surprised when I hear about those success stories of passive houses, just how well PHPP does seem to model things in the real world.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, individual units, an individual house might vary from the model because of occupant behavior, of course. But when you take a number of projects in aggregate, that correlation between actual performance and model performance is really tight. Eliminating what folks have called the performance gap, which is, that's such a powerful thing. It helps in so many ways, including, I think it helps policymakers in particular, when they recognize that, because you have a system of high performance building that allows you to know what you're going to get when you offer an incentive through good design. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of policy, I've talked about NatHERS and the fact that it is a requirement across Australia, but I think there's a growing recognition that it's a bare minimum, and there are opportunities to go much further beyond that. And even if you don't go all the way to passive house, it's a great way to just extend a little bit beyond just the bare minimum of what's required, and then also start thinking about some of those other aspects of what makes a house perform really well, even in a hot environment. And you're not going to get to really good summer comfort just by stuffing more and more insulation into a roof space or into the walls and just making the walls thicker. You need to be thinking about some other design strategies as well.
Right, and he described using the modeling tools, both the one that's native to NatHERS and also the PHPP, to help think through that process. And I think it was clear from the conversation that he's not a passive house purist, right? He's doing plenty of projects that are not passive house, and he has this process where he models what a project would be as passive house, and then, okay, well, what if we could do a little less on the insulation in the walls and the roof, and make different decisions about windows, which I think is it can be a really powerful approach. I think it's also good to acknowledge that there are another approach that we've of folks who've been on the podcast is, well, we don't really give people, we just do passive house. It's not a conversation that we have really with clients. And so, the result of course, that means that that other approach will result in a bunch of passive houses, whereas Alex's might not. But there are trade-offs there, and Alex is probably bringing projects up to higher performance than they otherwise would have been for clients who weren't looking for passive house. that was a little bit convoluted, but you know, they're both valid. They're both valid approaches with different aims, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that makes him very approachable, particularly in the Australian context, where he's not sort of really hardline. It opens up that it's a way to open up that conversation with a wider audience.
And maybe this is an indication. It could also be kind of an indication of what works at different stages of kind of market development as well. I mean, I have to admit, from you know, that I like the approach of just saying, hey, we're doing passive house. But that can be a luxury, a little bit of a more mature market where there are enough clients who are like are on board with that from the get-go. So
he's done a little bit of work with prefabrication as well, and that's, I'd say, emerging still in Australia and New Zealand, and shows a lot of potential for just being a kind of a natural partner for not just passive house, but airtight construction and good performing building envelopes. And Alex is discovering that as he gets the opportunity to work more with prefabricated elements and prefabricated building systems.
Yeah, I thought that his observation that the prefab approach to design sort of naturally leads to fewer thermal bridges was a really interesting one. That, you know, because there's at first you dial in the envelope, and then you figure out what elements you're adding to the design. It was a new way of looking at it that I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah. And speaking of thermal bridging and areas calculations, I encourage people to go and have a look at sharedspacearchitecture.com.au. Have a look at some of the projects that he showcases there, and jump in and have a look at some of the models, because Alex has actually made some of the modeling available online, which is very, very cool. So you can, there's a couple of projects on there where you can actually click through and see some of the models and look at the different layers. And from if you're at all into the geeky drawing side and the rendering side, then, which a lot of us are, let's face it, then have a look at his website. There's some really cool stuff on there.
Yeah, great interview, Matthew. Thank you for bringing it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've got a lot of things going on at the moment. I know that there's a lot of excitement going on in Sydney right now with the Icebox Challenge. It's cool to see that taking shape. And I know there are lots of really cool videos and posts from the Australian Passive House Association happening all the time there at the moment. But what else we got going on?
Well, and to get more information about that, you can also go to iceboxchallenge.org, and that the challenge will be going through March 4th, so it'll be culminating very soon. Well, at the Accelerator, we have coming up this week on Passive House Accelerator Live on Wednesday, which is Thursday your time. We're joined by Jamie Hart, who is with Public Design. He will be presenting about the University of British Columbia dormitory project. And then the week after that, on the week of March, so that would be March 9th, Wednesday, March 9th, so March 10th for you, we have a construction tech edition of Passive House Accelerator Live, which will be with Scott Farbman, who will be talking about ventilation system design in Passive House. Also, mark your calendar for March 17th, when we will be doing a component spotlight with Rockwool North America.
Awesome. Some great stuff going on. And how's that new format going at the Passive House Live, the Accelerator?
Yeah, it's going great. So, the first and third Wednesdays of each month, we do a project showcase edition of the live show. And then on the second and fourth, we do a construction tech edition. And I think the variety is really fun. And it's been going great.
Awesome. Very good. Hey, thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
We will be back again next week. We've got some great interviews in the can and some more lined up. So lots of great content there, which we're excited to bring you. So we'll catch you up next week.
Great. Thanks, Matthew.